Thank you, Jenna, for that great introduction. Thanks to all of you who are here late on a Monday, or a special thanks to our guests who are here very, very early on a Tuesday, I think, all the way from Australia. I'm looking forward to hearing your talks. Just by way of introduction and background, I'm Professor Carpenter. I direct Human Security Lab, as Jenna said. And this conversation stems from an initiative at the lab here at UMass on the protection of civilians in Ukraine, but particularly civilian men. You can find this on our website if you look under our projects and go to the Ukraine page. This is a research project that has involved, by the way, an incredible team of undergraduate and graduate student researchers here at UMass. We've been examining in particular the impacts of the martial law on men in Ukraine and what Ukrainians think about it. I'm going to share some findings from the lab momentarily, but just as background, when Russia invaded Ukraine back in February, one of the first things President Zelensky did, as any leader might do in such an existential crisis, was he declared martial law. And among the rules he established was a ban on all men 18 to 60 leaving the country, presumably in the event that they should need to be mobilized. Now, this involved suspending their human right to freedom of movement, which is protected under a treaty which Ukraine has signed. And this is a rule which can only be suspended under human rights law if it's strictly necessary and if it doesn't violate other kinds of rules, like against gender discrimination. And as I think the law scholars on the panel are going to show, this policy doesn't necessarily meet these standards. From my presentation, I want to emphasize that while nations under attack do have a right to mobilize their citizens of both genders, but it's really important to note that the vast majority of those men affected by this ban are not soldiers. They remain war-affected civilians because they've not been conscripted, nor trained, nor mobilized. They're simply being asked to sit in a shooting war under heavy bombardment, without jobs, separated from their loved ones, simply because they're men. So this is a policy that harms men as civilians, including many international students who have been denied the right to return to their studies abroad and instead are subject to missile strikes. I received this tweet from a student in Ukraine just today after I had advertised this webinar. And I believe there is a solidarity group of students from Ukraine in the audience who have asked for a few minutes to speak when the presentations are done. What I wanted to stress in my presentation is that this policy also has a negative effect on other civilians, women and children. One example from my own personal experience, before I turn to the survey results we've gathered as social scientists. This past spring, I traveled to the Ukrainian border to assist with the relief effort. I was driving refugees from the border to wherever they needed to go. And among them, I met this young woman, 9 months pregnant, traveling alone. This was her pink suitcase. And I asked about her family, and she said she was alone because her husband couldn't leave with her. And that was not surprising to me. But what surprised me is she said, and I had to leave my 4-year-old son with him because I can't travel 9 months pregnant with a little boy without my husband's support. So immediately it became clear this little boy had been trapped in the war zone because his father was trapped. And that surely was not Zelensky's intent with this plan. And now I got this woman all the way to Amsterdam. She had her baby, but ultimately she contacted me and asked me, because she knew me, it's always safer to get a ride with someone you know. She asked for help again. And this time what she asked for was not help getting out, but help getting back in to the war zone with her infant so she could be close to her son and her husband. Just cannot tell you what a weird feeling it was to be mobilizing my network of volunteers and couriers to take this woman and baby back into a war zone where the bombs were falling. She's there now. The family has been reunited. Here they are in Kiev. This is a picture she sent me on a good day. But on bad days, she texts me describing rockets that are falling over their heads, hiding out from them. She's panicked because she hears about fire bombings in other areas. I first learned of the Venezia firebombing before it hit the news here from this woman who had texted me early in the morning, just panicked at the thought that if she goes to the market or the hospital with her children, she might be next. So this family is also struggling economically, like many. They could earn money in Amsterdam, but it's very difficult in Ukraine right now. I'm actually personally connecting donations to support their photography business. And Jenna will put the GoFundMe in the chat for that if anyone wants to donate. But this is just one family. The point is one little example. It's a microcosm of the way this law is affecting not just men, but the entire civilian population and families as well. Now, we've been tracking this as social scientists for the past year. And we know that there was significant discontent in Ukraine over this policy. There were several petitions, spring and summer, with tens of thousands of signatories each. What we wanted to know was how widespread are these views? Human Security Lab this summer did a random survey of all adult internet users in Ukraine to try to find out what the wider population thinks about this. And I have some interesting findings to share. You can read more about them, by the way, in Foreign Policy magazine. We've just had a piece published on these findings this morning. So Jenna will put that into the chat as well. But I want to show you the basic results and a little bit of the analysis we did of what Ukrainians said in their own words before I turn it over to the other panelists. And we had asked Ukrainians a single question, which is whether they believed that civilian men should be permitted to flee the war or required to stay, as is currently required under the law, or whether they had a different view on the topic. And in each case, we allowed respondents to explain their answer in their own words. And what you can see initially is that a majority of the country did not click support. They either said, allow them to flee, or they said, we have a more nuanced view on the option. Maybe neither of these options is exactly consistent with our opinion. We also asked them to explain their view. The answers were a little different depending on what the initial position was. Those arguing that men should be forced to stay, many of them are really just saying, do what Zelensky said, we're going to follow the leader. So it's not that they would oppose changing the law, but it's like they want to follow the law. Some of them did express strong sense of civic duty to support the country. This sense of patriotic duty is so strong, you actually don't need a law like this forcing people to stay. People are going to volunteer. They're going to sign up. They're going to support the war in many ways. There's a lot of social pressure to do so. Even in this group who chose stay, there was a lot of reservations about the far-reaching scope of this law, qualifying their support for the law by proposing policy changes. For those who said people should be allowed to flee, we saw different kinds of arguments. We saw human rights arguments. We saw gender equality arguments. But we saw a preponderance of practical arguments about why this law should be changed, why many citizens could better support the war effort if they were allowed to leave the country, pay taxes back, protect civilians, etc. And those who had a different view, you can read more about this in the Foreign Policy article, but there were a variety of different arguments, particularly suggesting different kinds of policy changes. For example, some thought the law should remain in place, but it shouldn't be so gender-based. Able-bodied young women without children should be conscripted too, some citizens said. So what we noticed in the aggregate is really a couple of things. And the first is that even though people have different views on this topic across all these groups, we saw a great emphasis on policy alternatives, on making changes of some kind to this law, scaling it back in some way. So, for example, levy a war tax on those who want to go abroad and have them send remittances home. This is another way to support the war. Or allow people to leave, but with a requirement that they return when they are called. And the second thing is, the number of practical reasons Ukrainians give for changing the law to support the war effort, it's not all about human rights. Practical reasons is much more frequent. We saw a lot more of that. But there are human rights arguments. There are ethical arguments. There is some anger. We saw a lot of personal distress in these comments, a lot of anecdotes and arguments about the psychosocial harm, physical harm, and economic harm to civilian men and their families. But it's not all about human rights. These are not war resistors. These are patriots who want to support the conflict, but in other ways. And at the same time, human rights dimensions are extremely important. People do have the right of freedom of movement and conscientious objection. I'd like to turn things over now to my colleague, Amy McGuire of Newcastle University, to discuss the relevant international laws. And I'm happy to answer more questions on the survey science side of things in Q&A.